Thank you to everyone on the line today for joining us to learn more about total economic impact study that we did covering Cylance's endpoint security platform. Yeah, again, my name is Chris Sherman. As part of my device security research, I cover endpoint security suites and buyer strategies. But generally, I spend my time looking at specific buyer requirements and mapping those requirements to vendor capabilities through RFP support and other consulting services offered here at Forrester. And I've been covering the endpoint security space for about 9 years now, and starting back in 2010 when the death of AV was one of the most common topics. But companies like Cylance, proved that machine learning models deployed on the endpoint were viable and, judging by market interest, a necessary piece of the endpoint security stack. And today, ML-based prevention is a common requirement in RFPs. Compared to older forms of protection, an ML-first approach, especially when extended to detection and response, can really save money and time. And as Julia will show, this is something that can be mapped out. But before we get into the TEI results specifically, I'll spend about 20 minutes here going through the high-level trends, the trends specific to the endpoint security suite market, including some of the challenges that buyers are dealing with today and how market requirements are evolving over time. And I'll then turn it over to Bob to talk a bit about the Cylance approach, before Julia unveils the results of the study. All right, so before we talk about how to achieve ROI in the field of endpoint security, it's useful to just take a quick step back and look at what we're trying to achieve with these investments. In general, most companies are interested in protecting their enterprise networks and assets from attacks stemming from 5 primary threat actors: state, cyber criminals, malicious insiders, terrorists, and hacktivists. Now, you have differences in their approaches and the different defense methods required for each, but in general, your state actors are going to be more sophisticated, more difficult to prevent, as they're just more likely to use expensive zero-day exploits, for example, or exploit chaining, other multi-stage attack techniques that just might be less likely to be blocked with traditional prevention-oriented defenses. You also have cyber criminals who are increasingly just using more sophisticated targeted style attack methods and techniques that go beyond malware and involve things like fileless attacks and user exploitations. Their goals are going to be generally a bit different. They're going to be more focused on financial goals versus state. They might have financial goals along the path towards more state-focused geopolitical goals. You have also insiders who are leveraging their privileged access in general to commit things like fraud. General terrorists who use any tool available to create chaos, such as wiper or ransomware, or maybe direct functional manipulation of an endpoint asset to create chaos. And then hacktivists who do many of the same, but just to achieve maybe some political goal or morally righteous goal. But in general, you have specific and more broad challenges associated with each of these. But the main point here is companies are increasingly reporting concern over things like state-sponsored activity, but all the actors, not just state, are using more advanced tactics that mimic advanced threat actors compared to more broad attacks. And this is likely leading to an increase in concern that we see over targeted attacks in general. But the bottom line is, attacks cannot be thought of as broad or targeted, right? Today, they're all just varying degrees of targeted with very specific needs in terms of cybersecurity defense. In the same survey, we also look at buyer concern over asset types as well as the assets getting targeted. And in general, employee endpoints are common attack targets. That is some data here from our annual business technographic survey, where we had around 257 respondents who claimed to have been attacked in the last year. And out of these, 40% were focused on corporate servers, but I should point out mobile devices here includes laptops. So really the corporate owns laptops, employee-owned devices, were frequently targeted, really almost as frequently as corporate servers. And in the past, servers were targeted in upwards of 80% of the cases, with employee endpoints involved in less than half that. But today, it's clear, employee endpoints are just as attractive to attackers, as it's often an easy entry point, and also increasingly serves as a point of exfiltration or credential theft. Common complaint today And I'll go over some general complaints later that companies have over endpoint security suites, but one common one that we get is around the efficacy over fileless attack protection. Attackers have been leveraging more advanced methods of exploitation. As I mentioned before, today, in over half of the attacks, you see only fileless attack techniques used, living off the land, so to speak, using trusted applications maliciously, or memory-only script-based attacks like PowerShell or WMI. And these are only the threats that endpoint security suites need to protect against. Going beyond traditional malware and fileless variants, pretty important. There's a number of other threats here, and I've listed several on the slide. Companies also have to protect themselves against specific categories of threats like ransomware, Trojans, backdoors, user exploitation, or just attacks leveraging the user in its chain, right? The user exploitation bit is a bit tricky, right, especially in Europe, but it's also an important part of endpoint security and be increasingly so in the future. We see user behavior analysis in general today focus more on insider threat. Increasingly, it's going to have to morph more into protection over external attackers, right? As the level of inspection over user behavior required to protect against external actors increases, and really as it matches what's needed to detect insider fraud. Today, those are still very separate. We are asking today endpoint security suites to protect more of that user behavior than we ever did in the past. And this helps protect against risks associated with like business email compromise, phishing, really more generally any form of social engineering that could lead to an endpoint compromise. We also want to see our endpoint security products protecting against credential theft capabilities like LSAS specific protection measures. We also want them to be able to detect network attacks relevant to the endpoint, and correlate network security policies, threat activity with, endpoint security policies and threat activity. And this can help increase support that a company has over zero trust strategies, which we'll talk a little bit more later on in the presentation. And finally, sensitive data theft is, a top threat for endpoint security and just general security and risk professionals. And, we often forget to take into account data sensitivity when it comes to endpoint security. For example, automatically prioritizing alerts based on the related asset's proximity to sensitive data or how sensitive data flows through it. And of course, mitigating the risk through measures such as device control, encryption, and other DLP capabilities, may be pulled into the fold. Luckily, protecting the endpoint is a top priority today for security teams, but choosing the right tools has proved to be very difficult for many organizations looking to modernize their overall approach to endpoint security, right? Ideally without introducing additional friction and expenses. As most of you know, there are many approaches to endpoint security, right? Many different vendors that we're tracking here at Forrester, right? Each vendor addresses certain scenarios, but none are really broad enough to cover all the different attack types completely, right? There is no silver bullet. We'll need a combination of software and services to prevent, and detect threats on the endpoint. The strategy in the past has been simply to invest in more products, more point products, more layers of prevention without integrations or orchestration, more layers of detection. I've organized the adoption numbers of the primary forms of protection here from our latest annual security survey published this past September. Anti-malware and EDR lead the pack right there at the top here. But this is the first year EDR has been in the top 5, right? We've seen a great increase in EDR use, while anti-malware has been pretty stagnant or decreased over time. In general, we see these two merging where the two will likely be considered one and the same or inseparable as two technologies continue to merge. We see companies investing in other approaches, the so-called positive security model, vendors that support that model, right? Such as app control measures like whitelisting or privilege management, the sandboxing solutions or execution isolation tools. And we've displayed all these here, and each offers varying levels of protection with varying levels of expertise needed to operate them, as well as friction that goes along with operating them, both admin friction as well as user friction. But with so many different products in the market, it's difficult for buyers to determine which offers the best approach or the best ROI. And the bottom line is tool complexity and just an overall lack of efficacy has led many shops to rethink how they approach endpoint security these past couple of years. And this is also part of our premise for our study with Cylance and the total economic impact. And these challenges are just made worse by the fact many shops have to deal with 6 or more endpoint security agents in their environment. And if you cut this by 10,000 employees or more, it jumps up to 12 and a half. This data comes from a couple of different studies, including one past PEI study done here at Forrester, as well as a Ponemon study from the past. It's a very important topic and one that gets brought up a lot, agent fatigue, right? It's a very common inquiry topic here at Forrester, and it's just been getting worse as companies are applying more and more endpoint, like point products to try to fill their gaps in their strategy. There has been consolidation this past year and a half, and it's seeing more suites and fewer point products, which is, I think, a good overall direction, but it's been very problematic trying to move over to more modern endpoint security suites for buyers who have so many legacy products already in their environment. It's very important before you introduce any new security product into your portfolio, into your practice, right, to do due diligence. You don't want to introduce new products with crazy high barriers in terms of skill to operate these tools, only to realize you're limiting your return on security investment in the long term. So what works today in terms of vendor capabilities? And out of the amalgamation of endpoint security technologies that makes up most of these vendors' portfolios, and approaches, what works today? Now, based on my calls with buyers, customers generally appreciate that their endpoint security suites take a high degree of action, without admin involvement. For example, blocking a known malicious behavioral pattern or executable before it runs without requiring verdict made by a human or an admin. On the other hand, most companies, they recognize the need for additional services, generally in the area of detection analysis and response, such as MDR services. And many of the suite vendors today offer a combination of services and software that integrate the service workflows tightly with the deployed console and its own workflows. So for some vendors, buying services is a relatively easy decision in terms of integrating their analysis and remediation workflows in with your own. It's something that's frequently brought up as a positive by customers. A third down the list here, of course, the ESS vendors or endpoint security suite vendors are best at protecting against known file-based threats, their legacy. And generally, this is done through a combination of app control measures and active threat protection measures like ML-based prevention and, of course, signature-based anti-malware. No one said that these AV solutions weren't good at stopping known threats, right? They just clearly had to evolve beyond the static indicators. And on that segue, the ESS vendors are also good at stopping exploit behaviors already known to be indicative of exploits. In general, all of the prevention-oriented suites have evolved to balance more behavioral detection capabilities, such as EDR. And, this aids customers in giving them a more general or a more holistic view around endpoint security suite alerts, such as giving you context configuration or just configuration risks associated with maybe the secure configuration of the asset or the general inherent risk of the device or the data, the user of that, around the alert. Right? Ideally, you want to prioritize your alerts based on real-world data, right? And this is what a lot of the vendors are working towards today. Now, for the other side of the story, what do customers frequently express concern to us over, when it comes to their endpoint security suite purchases? Well, unsurprisingly, they continue to struggle with zero-day threat prevention. If it's not known or hasn't been seen prior to the alert, then the efficacy goes down, right? Inconsistent levels of protection between different OS platforms. I'll mention some of the longer-term trends around this in the next slide, but in general, Linux, Chrome OS, Apple OS, even IoT now, we're increasingly seeing more device types being pulled into the endpoint security suite strategies and associated technologies used to enforce those strategies. You don't always need anti-malware or things like execution isolation on all of the different devices, right? But in general, there are important security functions like EDR or vulnerability management that are important across all device types. That lack of feature parity is something that is brought up as a frustrating point by many buyers. Also, many solutions require a cloud connection for maximum performance and don't offer that maximum performance. In some cases, very limited performance when they're off network. This is becoming less and less of an issue every year, I'd say, but it still remains a top complaint. A lot of the endpoint security suites also lack scalability. This is actually a related point to the prior, right? Especially those that are heavy on the prevention side, such as execution isolation. They may deploy well in small pilots where the hardware is consistent and relatively well controlled, but then when it's moved out to a larger 1,000+ node deployment, things can easily break down. Features might have to be turned off or put into different hardware groups based not on risk but hardware capability. This further complicates this product operation, as well as this policy and update mechanisms, right? Especially for non-cloud-based systems. This can be especially an issue. And also, in many solutions, if not all, struggle with fileless and script-based malware. This is why it's important to look to third-party efficacy testing, when choosing a product. Going down the list, many suites also require too many full-time employees to run effectively. This is especially true with vendors who came from a more detection-oriented background. They tend to be highly manual in their approach, and thus they require more skilled FTEs. In general, all of the suites are evolving towards more automated prevention, detection, and response, and most can benefit from more integration with IT ops tools and workflows, if not all, really. I'll discuss this a bit more in the next slide, but this is an important one to call out because it's an area that many vendors are working to improve currently, and they vary greatly in their levels of integration with outside tools. It's definitely a point of differentiation today. And finally, customers still complain about a high user experience impact in some of the ESS vendors. This is nothing new. Endpoint, in general, endpoint suites have had a bad reputation for killing endpoint performance or, more generally, user experience. Whether it's broken inter-process links, enforcing too strict user privileges, not commensurate with the company's culture, or simply just breaking up the employee workflow for pauses while an executable is scanned in the cloud before execution, things like that. Right? The whole industry struggles with the perception of introducing friction into the employee workflow and not aiding or supporting it. And this is the main disagreement, I would say, security and IT ops teams have with one another, especially when it comes to prioritizing remediation actions as well as patches. All right, and a couple months ago, we took this a bit further and actually evaluated the top 15 endpoint security suite providers in a wave and published it this past September. And essentially, we looked at all the different buying trends. We interviewed a number of customers and conducted an RFP-style assessment and came up with some high-level trends here that I'll quickly discuss. And this is pointing more toward the future. If you're looking for an endpoint security suite today, these are some things you might want to just keep in mind. First off, I've talked about this quite a bit already. The two, right, prevention and detection are coming together. It's clear that combining threat prevention and threat detection in one suite is the preferred way, right, to acquire endpoint security today. And this is also a big trend that we've been covering really for many years at Forrester, and we've required in all of our waves going back to 2015 for the 2016 wave. And that's really we're just seeing the rise of many different capabilities on the endpoint, right? So first you have obviously detection. We're seeing more of the endpoint security suite vendors building in automated behavioral detection capabilities and response activities based on analysis and detection workflows, and all done ideally in an orchestrated and automated manner. We're also seeing capabilities around native security management. There's just a general rise of native security, endpoint security controls, and where vendors coordinate those native capabilities alongside their own third-party security functions. For example, over half of enterprises today are using native anti-malware capabilities, but most still require management over those features combined with more advanced behavioral protection. In general, suite customers want more automation and integration with IT ops tools. I mentioned this before, but it's clear that buyers want more integration across their portfolio of endpoint security and management technologies, right? We're even seeing a quarter of our endpoint security vendor selection inquiries coming from IT ops as part of a UEM or Unified Endpoint Management selection project. Also, as detection today can't be completely automated, services will have to fill the gap, over the short term anyway. for most organizations, without the skilled full-time employees to operate the more advanced aspects of these suites. This is why we see MDR interest so high in this market. Many of the vendors also, just in response to buyer demands and the need to continuously improve product effectiveness, many vendors have brought together user behavior analysis with process-based behavior analysis. I've talked a little bit about this already, but this trend will likely continue and maybe even extend to identity and access management, such as like applications like biometrics, but just as biometric authentication becomes more realistic. Right? And there are other areas too, but in general, we expect, based on the roadmaps of the vendors as well as buyer demands, we see more endpoint security coverage over user behavior in the near future. And finally, patching. It's not a new topic, but unfortunately, 7 years after I wrote my prioritized patching process, or P3 framework, and really tried to start pushing vendors and buyers to include more vulnerability management control within their endpoint security suites and strategies, right? Still today, this is a very weak point for many vendors. But it is improving, and possibly due to maybe the final bullet there, right? Interest in zero trust policies is growing on the endpoint, and this has had the effect of motivating buyers to push for more, context building around endpoint alerts to better determine risk levels. And this, ideally, you're going to bring vulnerability management into the fold here if you really want to identify risk and control risk. I'll talk a little bit more on this in my final slide, but in general, we see this as a good direction for the market. Before we wrap up my section here, how does Forrester view a modern endpoint security suite? Well, from 2015 on, we've been publishing this graphic with our waves in the space. I've updated a bit to reflect modern requirements in the next few slides, but in general, these basic three capabilities, threat prevention, detection, and response, have remained the core three throughout my waves, and will likely remain throughout the next generation of products. Right? Older generations of endpoint security tools were focused only on prevention, but every single vendor in the market today balances prevention and detection. Right? It's table stakes to be considered a suite in this market. So what specifically is needed in a modern endpoint security suite? First up, a suite's prevention capabilities has to reduce that attack surface to a manageable level. Right, by including capabilities like exploit protection, patching, app control, privilege management, file and folder encryption or full disk encryption, maybe management over file vault or BitLocker, right? Things like, things that are used to reduce that attack surface and limit the likelihood that an attacker will be able to get onto a system and execute a script or payload. And a key benefit of having prevention and detection tied together, ideally you're spending less time on the other cycle by limiting noise. Ideally, a modern endpoint security suite has on-host machine learning on both the prevention and detection side, that doesn't require frequent updates and protects the endpoint when it's off network, for example. And what does, though, get past prevention, ideally gets inspected and caught by detection technologies like endpoint visibility and EDR tools, behavioral forensics tools, right? Many solutions today either don't go deep enough into endpoint behavior or collect too much information that's not actionable to the enterprise. And, either way, though, you want detection to give you that purview of what's going on past prevention layers, how the endpoint is interacting with the system. And I say system, it's more than just other endpoints, right? Other users, other cloud resources, how data is processed on the endpoint, right? You want to ideally build an understanding of how risk is manifested on the endpoint. And this is done primarily through detection technologies. And then finally, you want remediation of control to be closely tied with the prior two, right? In order to reduce the overall friction that your team experiences when just trying to bring together multiple endpoint security capabilities under one practice. Introducing automation into the decision-making workflows for these systems can really help reduce the staffing required to operate some of the more advanced detection technologies. And ideally, this helps operationalize threat intelligence gathered from internal and external sources. But ultimately, you want to have an endpoint security strategy that leverages capabilities in each of these three buckets, with intel, policy, and remediation automation driving the connections between the three. All right, before they pass the ball over to Bob and Julia, here's a quick rundown of capabilities to look for when trying to support a zero trust endpoint strategy. I talked a little bit about this before. It's something we're getting a lot of interest here at Forrester. I think it'd be worth diving into a bit here. So first, what is a zero trust strategy in the endpoint? Really, this means flipping your general assumption about how you classify risk and how you map enforcement levels to that risk. First, you never assume trust in zero trust. Kind of goes with it, right? Your security solution should always be tracking the trust levels of users, devices, apps, and control measures need to be commensurate with those levels of trust, right? The positive security model is a good example of this philosophy. Some security solutions treat behaviors and executables as good until they act in a known bad way, right? This is an example of the so-called negative security model. The positive security model techniques look for indicators of trust, specifically allowing known trusted applications or actions, right? And you want to layer your endpoint security capabilities in a way that establishes risk levels based on endpoint configuration and real-time behaviors. This is critical as it allows for a complete picture of risk. And then ultimately, your enforcement actions can be taken based on that risk. The common philosophy here is that trust should never be assumed. Your endpoint security response actions need to be handed down based on that point in time risk. For example, if there are several assets showing potential lateral movement through a credential reuse attack, your solution needs to prioritize alerts and remediation actions based on your overall risk, based on sensitive data, loss potential, correlate that with the individual criticalities on those endpoints. And if any of you want more information on the Zero Trust Framework, feel free to send me an email. I'll have my contact info at the end of the webinar. With that, a quick overview, I'll pass it over to Bob from Cylance to talk a bit more about their specific offering as tested by Julia in our extended TIA team. Bob?
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. That really is some great stuff. So my name is Bob Slocum. I'm responsible for product marketing at BlackBerry Silence. And I just kind of wanted to take a quick minute or two just to show a little bit about, for those that don't know, what Cylance does and the BlackBerry Silence, why that makes sense. So real quickly, if you look at or you hear any of the prevent first approach to security, what that means is Cylance was really the very first company to take artificial intelligence and to apply it to cybersecurity. And we take this prevent first. So if you look at the bottom axis, that is the cost of security versus the time to security. And our prevent first approach, our platform, it's not that we prevent 100%. We all know nobody's going to prevent 100%, but we do have efficacy rates that are north of 99%, that we're able to prevent things from ever happening, malware from ever execution. If you look at, we do detect and we do response. And as we look at detect and response, that's where we're starting to get into more semi-automated or even more manual, which is a lot more costly. So we do detection, we do response, we do it very well. But the advantage is we're able to stop and prevent a lot of the attacks before it ever gets to that point. Whereas the competition, they kind of start up here in the longer time to security and a much more costly manual or semi-automatic. And it's really interesting is as we talk about this massive shortage of skilled IT security professionals, we're really talking that top right? The response side of it, some of the detect into the response. We also offer a full litany of managed services with Guard, where we can do the complete prevention, detect and respond and manage it all for you in an MDR platform. So a little bit about BlackBerry Silence. I think it's worth taking a moment to take a step back. We were the very first company to apply data science to endpoint protection. There was a myth I heard out there, we do leverage the cloud. We absolutely use the cloud. That's where we run our math algorithms. But we're able to take that, shrink that algorithm down and run it locally on your endpoint. So now when endpoints are offline, air gap environments, we're able to offer the same level of protection on that endpoint. We have a complete litany of services, including full staff augmentation services. As Chris kind of touched on earlier, we know that there's challenges in finding skilled IT security professionals. It's well documented, some of the shortages, and we offer compromised assessments through managed detect and response through staff augmentation services. And together, BlackBerry Silence, we're protecting all 7 of the G7 governments, over 8,000 customers, and over 500 million endpoints. And those are endpoints ranging from PCs to mobile devices to surgical machines, and including space stations. So when we look at BlackBerry, where they were already in 170 million vehicles. And the really exciting thing with the BlackBerry Silence is you look at applying the AI and how we apply AI to endpoint security. You already see us expanding that into the mobile space and then into the Internet of Things, and that finishing that complete circle. So with that being said, I know you didn't dial in to hear me talk about this, but we'd love to come out. Anybody wants us to come out and talk a little bit deeper about some of the things and exciting roadmap items that we have coming out, including the user and behavior around analytics and continuous authentication products for both endpoints and mobile that we have coming out in the early part of 2020. So with that being said, I know we're dialed in today to talk about the total economic impact report. So let me bring on Julia.
Thanks, Bob. My name is Julia Fadzeyeva, as I'm a consultant with the Forrester's Total Economic Impact practice. And at this point, you're probably wondering what TEI is. TEI stands for the Total Economic Impact, and we built the TEI methodology about 20 years ago because Forrester found that over 90% of IT decision makers in North America see value in a business case. And so the question became, what is the effective business case? Early on, the case studies focused on the total cost of ownership primarily, including the IT costs and IT savings. And then going one step further, the ROI analysis took into account tangible business benefits such as efficiency and incremental revenue. And today, the TI case study looks at ROI, but also takes into account risk and uncertainty around the investment. TI framework provides also a look at flexibility and scalability. And so it's a realistic and conservative technology assessment. Within the TI framework, we look at the benefits such as improvements to productivity, efficiency, cost avoidance, or incremental revenue. We also look at costs such as implementation, ongoing cost support, and training. We also consider flexibility. Now that you have the technology, what new long-term paths are opening to your organization and what impact they may bring to your business. And as a final step, we look at the risk to account for certain variations in benefits and in the costs. All of these considerations come together for the total economic impact analysis. To build a TEI case study, we take a multi-step approach. We start with a series of conversations within Cylance and Forrester experts to lay the foundation for the conversations that we later have with customer. And then we interviewed one customer who is using Cylance to understand their experience before and after they made the decision to invest in Cylance. Based on this interview, we then built a financial model that I will share with you in the course of this presentation. But before we'll dive into the study results, just a minute on the fine print here. The study is commissioned by Cylance, and Cylance provided the name of the organization for Forrester to interview. But beyond the introduction, Cylance was not involved in the interview, and the interview is confidential with Forrester. Cylance also reviewed Forrester findings, but Forrester maintains full editorial control over the study. There is also one thing I want to remind you so that you think about it while you're listening to the study outcomes. The analysis that you're about to see provides a framework for evaluating the outcomes of the investment. And Forrester strongly advises that every listener uses their own estimates within this framework to determine whether it's appropriate for you and your organization to invest in Cylance. So let's look at the high-level results of the total economic impact study now. To summarize it in one statement, Forrester concluded that Cylance Protect and Cylance Optics provide AI-driven threat prevention, detection, and response security solutions that protect endpoint servers and cloud workloads. Cylance Protect offers real-time predictive threat prevention and visibility into the endpoint environment, and that allows cybersecurity teams to discover and stop potential threats even before they propagate. Cylance Optics enables faster enterprise-wide threat hunting. Security teams can now interrogate endpoints in seconds and store critical data for future investigations. What does it mean from the financial standpoint? The first number I want to mention is a net present value of $7 million. The NPV represents the benefits over costs over the 3-year period. And this includes a 10% discount to account for the fact that money is worth more today than it is next year or the year after. Thinking about pure benefits, we are looking at 14 million in benefits over the course of 3 years. The NPV of 7 million also resulted in 99% return on investment. And for those who are less familiar with the ROI, a negative number would mean that you've lost essentially money as a result of your investment. 0 is that break-even point where you've been able to recover it. And any positive number would mean that you're benefiting from the investment. In this case, with the ROI of 99%, you can say that you've essentially doubled your investment in Cylance over the course of 3 years. Let's look deeper into how we arrived at this conclusion. So for this study, Forrester interviewed one customer, and this was a multinational enterprise that was headquartered in Europe. It operates 500 locations in 150 countries and has 45,000 employees. The organization manufactures tools and tooling systems for industrial metal cutting and provides services and technical solutions for the mining and construction industries, and there is more to its business. The company also runs Silence Protect and Silence Optics on its 45,000 endpoints. Prior to becoming a customer, this organization has been using an on-premises legacy endpoint security solution in partnership with a service provider. The legacy solution only offered signature-based antivirus without any EDR capabilities. The company experienced a couple of different challenges. First of all, they had insufficient protection against security threats. They experienced multiple ransomware attacks a few years back, including a WannaCry attack that was reported in the media and potentially had negative impact on brand reputation for this company. Operationally, the company struggled to update legacy endpoint security solutions. The cybersecurity team was spending considerable time fixing problems with the legacy software, in addition to remediating compromised users and also re-imaging machines, and they didn't really want to continue on that path. And finally, there was no way to effectively manage unauthorized employee software downloads. These downloads created hardware performance issues and frequently increased the risk of illegal software or malware being downloaded and installed. And the company had no control over it, unfortunately. What's important is that once they've implemented Cylance and replaced their old tool, they were able to overcome those challenges and achieve the goals that they set for themselves. First of all, they've improved threat protection, and that was the key benefit for them. The customer has not experienced any major malware or ransomware attacks since deploying BlackBerry Silence. The organization also gained a single vision for cyber defense. Previously, individual departments often deployed their own endpoint security solutions, and the company didn't really have a single view. Now, BlackBerry Silence provides a single endpoint security tool, and all the endpoints solutions that have been previously used are decommissioned. With BlackBerry Silence, better threat protection has reduced the number of compromised users, and any necessary mitigation can be now provided within minutes. BlackBerry Silence has nearly eliminated the need to re-image machines, and for the team, it meant that they can focus on more proactive activities. With BlackBerry Silence, the company also has more control over unwanted software within the network. If an employee now downloads software that could be malicious, BlackBerry Silence sends an alert to the security team and the software is blocked. So the employee now has to ask for approval before running this software, which is a win for the company. To give you a sense of what the Silence customer is saying, I want to share the words from the head of cybersecurity at this company. Now with Cylance, if we detect something, we're able to look into the client's preempt and deploy the mitigation protection just within minutes. Also, they said that we have gone from around 50 compromised users each day to around 0 or 1 some days. The situation has totally changed for us. And in the TI study, there are more quotes and stories in the document, so I encourage you to take a look at it, but this one should give you a taste for the sentiment about what the customer felt about Silence. And now that we've set the stage, let's look at the most interesting part. What benefits did the organization see as a result of using Silence? The highest benefit comes from decommissioning former security software. Secondly, the organization became more efficient in remediation and investigations. Working with Silence also helped the company reduce the risk of a security breach and provided some smaller benefits that we have been able to quantify and that we can explore in depth. The customer completely decommissioned its legacy on-premises endpoint security solution after adopting BlackBerry Silence. The customer paid its former service provider $4.5 million annually to protect its 45,000 employees. This fee included the cost of the on-premises legacy endpoint security tool, also the service provider fees and underlying infrastructure costs such as servers that they needed. After 3 years, the composite organization saw the savings of more than $8 million once they decommissioned the software. The manufacturer also significantly improved the productivity of its cybersecurity team. Previously, the team spent time reactively troubleshooting and maintaining the legacy endpoint security solution. The cybersecurity team had to push out daily software updates for the legacy tools, but now with the SaaS solution, it's always up to date. They don't have to do that anymore. The cybersecurity team can now proactively focus on threat hunting and investigating more serious threats, and they're very excited about that. Before Silence, 4 to 5 security FTEs were spending time troubleshooting the legacy solution and ensuring that it was deployed on every client. While there was no reduction in the team staffing after Silence was implemented, the 4.5 employees focusing on endpoint security can now do more productive, proactive activities, and Forrester assumes that their productivity improvement can be summarized to 20%. With the efficiency that was enabled by Silence, the company essentially freed up 20% of the team's time, which saved the organization the total of over $161,000 in 3 years. In 2017, the customer experienced multiple malware attacks, including a WannaCry ransomware attack, and the press reported about this attack. So the company was concerned that it had a negative impact on their brand reputation. The ransomware attack was a key turning point in the company's decision to implement a new endpoint security tool. So since installing BlackBerry Silence, customers had not experienced any major malware attacks. During the rollout process, BlackBerry Silence alerted the customer to a ransomware outbreak, while the legacy endpoint solution did not find it and did not alert them. And that was another point of reassurance for the team that they were making the right choice. Reducing the number of breaches and even the risk of a breach saves the organization from costly cleanup and recovery efforts. The customer started with a 30% risk of a major ransomware or malware attack while using the legacy endpoint tool. And the risk has dropped to 5% with BlackBerry Silence. The average annual cost of a ransomware and malware attack is about $2.9 million. With Silence, the organization was able to reduce the risk by 25%, which resulted in $1.9 million in savings over the course of 3 years. The customer also now has fewer compromised users and can remediate issues more quickly. Silence protects, stops attacks before they happen, and because it uses AI to inspect applications that are attempting to execute on an endpoint. So the overall number of attacks is reduced. In the rare cases that there is a compromised user, Silence Optics steps in and allows the cybersecurity team to quickly review files and activities that have been tagged as suspicious and to determine if an endpoint has been compromised. This speeds the investigation process significantly, and the appropriate mitigation can be dispatched within minutes. The manufacturer that we interviewed was seeing about 50 compromised users per day with the legacy security solution. And with BlackBerry Silence, there is usually 0 or sometimes 1 compromised user. So the organization was able to save about over $3 million in end user productive time as a result of faster remediation over the 3-year period, because each user can save about 4 hours of their time. BlackBerry Silence has also nearly eliminated the need to re-image machines. It allows remote mitigation of most problems rather than taking a machine offline to a reimage. Less reimaging means that BlackBerry Silence solution saves both IT time and the end user time. The manufacturer used to reimage up to 10 machines per week with the legacy endpoint solution, and with BlackBerry Silence, there have been 0 machines that were reimaged at the time of the interview. Forrester assumes that under the legacy solution, 30 machines could be reimaged each month, and with BlackBerry Silence, that number goes down to 1. It takes about 8 hours to reimage a machine, but during that time, the IT service desk technician can also work on other things. So only 20% of the IT service desk technician's time is spent actively on their reimaging. When a user machine needs to be reimaged, the average knowledge worker loses about 4 hours of their time. As a result of implementing the new tool for BlackBerry Silence, the organization reduced both the IT and the end user time lost on remediation and saved over $230,000 in 3 years. And finally, today the cybersecurity team has much more control over illegal software or unwanted software within the network. Previously, the team had limited visibility into the employee software downloads and had to conduct regular software audits to identify unauthorized software. Today, the customer does software audits on a daily basis, and if an employee downloads software that could be malicious, BlackBerry Silence sends an alert to the security team, and the software is being blocked. So the employee, if they want to run the software, they actually need to go to the cybersecurity team and get an approval. So because these audits were automated, the organization saved about $55,000 over the 3-year period in their analysts' time. So in addition to all the benefits that we were able to put a number to, customers talked about the benefits that they couldn't really quantify, but that were critical for them. First of all, the client can withstand threats without any cloud connection today. The customer required endpoint security protection for multiple locations within varying levels of connectivity. And in the interview, they commented that for their company, it was very important to be able to withstand threats without constantly needing to connect to the cloud, and they were able to achieve that. Forrester also saw the benefit of decommissioning other ad hoc tools, not just their main security tools that were used by individual teams, and that simplified the endpoint security stack for the organization. As you probably expect, the organization incurred several costs from using Silence. They paid annual fees for the platform based on the number of endpoints, and they also assigned resources to implement the solution and to perform the ongoing work in the tool. Forrester accounted for these costs as we built a financial model. Also, let's look at the business opportunities that were enabled by BlackBerry Silence technology. Before implementing them, the cybersecurity team was really caught up in the daily noise of managing the solution. And today, the team has more flexibility to spend time on investigations in threat hunting. And as I mentioned earlier, when we built the TEI case study, we want to make sure that we account for the variability between organizations. And that's why we make the risk adjustments. We make sure that adjust the benefits down by 5, 10, or 15% depending on the level of the risk. And we also adjust the costs up to make sure that we account for uncertainty in the technology investment, such as maybe your implementation period is going to be longer or your security team is higher, things like that. So it means that you should feel pretty good about the numbers that you see in the study because they're going to be fairly conservative. And with that, I want to give a last look at the financial outcomes. So the light green columns here represent the benefits and the dark green bars show the costs. The yellow line is showing the cumulative net benefits. The total NPV reaches $7 million in a 3-year period, and the ROI amounts to 99% in those 3 years, which is an excellent outcomes. As I mentioned, this already accounts for the risk, so you should feel pretty confident about this number. And with this last look at the financial outcome, I want to conclude the brief summary of the TEI study. The full version definitely has more content and more real examples of how the customer used the platform, but I think it's definitely enough for today, and I want to pass it back to Bob for any closing remarks in the Q&A.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Julia and Chris. I really appreciate you you joining us today. A couple of things real quickly. I just put the stats down. This is directly out of the report. And the numbers and stats were pretty staggering. I mean, you had a 99% return on investment for this customer. They were able to cut the machinery imaging by 97%. And again, these stats are all in the report, but reducing the number of full-time employees needed to manage the system, because you're not doing patching, updates on so it reduced from as high as 5 full-time employees down to a half a person's time. And the interesting other one that jumped out was the 25%. That 25%, when they deployed Cylance, they had actually discovered a ransomware attack was underway, and they were able to stop and remediate that attack. Now, they were breached. It had happened. It had slipped right through the legacy AV solution that they were running. So there was still a cost incurred by them. But again, it was much lower by 25% than it would have been had it just run its course and not been stopped. We are running a program through the end of February to help customers migrate from legacy AV to a prevention first approach. Regardless, starting at a minimum of a 1-year license, you get 6 months free. And for any orders over 1,000 endpoints, it'd also include free migration services. So we would love to sit down, talk to you, go through either the TEI report, our roadmap will show you kind of the direction that we're going in with BlackBerry Silence. It's a real exciting time with some real exciting products. I know we ran right up to the hour here. So again, a special thank you to Julia and to Chris. This was great. Really appreciate you joining us. And thank you all for listening in today. Hope you all have a wonderful day.